another piece is when it comes to thinking about evangelicals and science, particularly around climate change, is that Neil Pogue is an environmental historian, wrote this really great book called The Nature of the Religious Right. And he tries to tell this story. He's looking at the quote unquote the kind of the conflict story I was talking about earlier today. He says, where does this conflict between evangelicals and climate change and climate science come from? And he looks at the history and he says, wow, it's actually a very recent development. He says if you start in the 60s all the way through even the early 90s, there's a robust evangelical environmental philosophy called environmental stewardship. And this wasn't just a radical approach. This was he says, the mainstream approach among evangelicals. Now, you could quibble with it in many ways, and maybe it's not the right kind of environmentalism, but that's a separate question. But it is an environmental philosophy, and it has an ethic to it. And what Neil Pogue did was he looked at some of the kind of primary spokespersons for evangelicalism during that period and found that they often had an environmental stewardship ethic. He also looked at evangelical homeschool materials that also had a more or less pro-environmental type teaching that was pro-science and getting students engaged in science, and even reading excerpts from Rachel Carson, right, who was such a key environmental writer in the 1960s. And all of that changes around 1993, 1994, particularly when climate change came to be the dominant way of organizing almost all kind of environmental thought, if you will. So that's a key moment there. And more attention, I think, needs to be paid to that. But if we're talking about the early 90s, that's not that long ago, when we really start to see a major rift where evangelicals on the whole kind of leave a mainstream environmental stewardship ethic and come to talk more about, say, the economy as trumping the environment in that sense.